Hey everyone, this is Richard Gibbons, CEO of Bluegrass Realtors, and what I want to do for this video is take some time to record what I presented at the member forum and what I've been presenting at multiple brokerages around the area, just so you have a video recording of it and can share it with others and review what was said and things like that. So the first thing I want to do is just kind of, like I said, introduce myself. I am the new CEO here at Bluegrass Realtors. My email is richard@bluegrassrealtors.com. I'm completely open to feedback and things like that. One of the biggest things that I want to make sure I do here at Bluegrass Realtors is create good feedback loops. So we have our committee structure, we have our board of directors. Of course, these are the people that represent you and help make the decisions at your association and your MLS. So reach out to them if you have questions, but I'm also here as a resource as well. So reach out to me if you have questions and things like that. Always want to have open conversation. Like I said, I've been doing this presentation at multiple brokerages. I'm open to doing them at more. I like getting in front of the membership and answering the tough questions. There's a lot of questions that I'm going to cover in this presentation that are the tough ones that people are asking that they don't always get the answers to. So that's always my goal here, is creating that and just really want to encourage people to reach out, and we're always here to help at Bluegrass Realtors. So the next thing I do have to kind of park on for a second here is just a couple of disclaimers to get out of the way. Of course, nothing I say here is intending to create a best practices across the industry. We're not trying to set any kind of limits. We're not trying to interfere in anybody's conduct of business. There's some places I do get into some business practices in this presentation, but it is not necessarily saying you have to do this or you should do this or things like that. What I'm trying to do in this presentation is give you a bigger picture view so that you can make these decisions yourself. Along those same lines, I'm going to be going into a little bit of legal opinion as part of this. I am not a lawyer. I didn't even stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. Any of these things, of course, consult your own attorney, but I'm just kind of giving my legal opinion on how some things went in this case. And again, I'm not advising you on business practices. We're going to talk a little bit about business practices. We're going to talk a little bit about where I think the industry is going, but talk to your broker about your business practices. They're the ones who set those, and just because I say it does not mean it is gospel. It is, what I'm going to say is I feel strongly where the industry is going, but it does not mean that's the law of the land. It does not mean there's anything wrong with doing the things we are right now as we move through this process and kind of learn all this together. So kind of a settlement 101 to start with. On March 15th of this year, NAR reached a $418 million settlement to resolve litigation regarding broker commissions. I'm assuming everybody's heard of it at this point, but I'm still going to kind of give a real quick high-level overview of it for you. There's kind of 5 key points to it. Of course, there's a release of liability. It resolves all claims against NAR associations and MLSs and Realtor members. Anybody who's a member of NAR by August 17th is covered and release of liability under this settlement. Within the MLS, of course, there is a new rule prohibiting offers of compensation on the MLS. Cooperative compensation is still allowed off of the MLS. We're going to talk a little bit about can versus should with that in a bit, but it is still allowed at this point. Of course, MLS participants working with buyers must enter into a written agreement before the touring of a home. Something else we're going to go into more detail later, but that's one of the key points here. There is the settlement payment of the $418 million spread out over approximately 4 years. NAR has come out and said there will not be an increase in dues in 2024 or 2025 because of the settlement, but again, more detail on that later. And then, of course, a continued denial of wrongdoing. NAR does continue to deny any wrongdoing in connection with the MLS Cooperative Compensation Model Rule, which, of course, brings up the question, okay, why didn't we appeal? But I'm going to be answering that question here in a little bit. So the first thing I want to make super clear, though, is that compensation post-settlement does continue to be allowed. It is negotiable and should always be negotiable. The fixed fee commission paid directly by consumers, concessions from the seller, portion of listing brokers' compensation. All of these things are still allowed. What I say for this a lot of times is that how a realtor gets paid might change, but if a realtor gets paid, does not. A realtor still provides incredible value for the most complicated and likely most expensive transaction of a consumer's life. So that's not something that really needs to be worried about. The other thing I like pointing out is that on facts.realtor, NAR has put out a couple one-pagers for buyers and sellers that have a lot of great information on them. So if you go to facts.realtor, just type that into your browser, facts.realtor, that's it, no .com, no nothing, facts.realtor, they have this information on there for you, as well as some other information as well. So what I want to do for just a second to dig a little bit deeper on the settlement is I want to park for a second and talk some about the Department of Justice. Now, this is the one part of this presentation that's going to be a little bit gloom and doom, but I promise you I do it for a reason to make a little more sense later. So this is actually a slightly unrelated case. This is No Select versus MLS PIN, Property Information Network. And one of the things that those of us that are following along with the Sitzer case got really annoyed with the DOJ for a while, as they kept poking their nose in different places, saying, that's not good enough, that's not good enough, that's not good enough, and they were never actually telling us what they wanted. Well, in this No Select versus MLS Property Information Network case, they submitted a statement of interest. And within that statement of interest is a couple key things that I think tells us exactly what the DOJ wants. Now, one of the first things they said is this first sentence on this screen. As long as sellers can make buyer-broker commission offers, they will continue to offer customary commissions out of fear that buyer brokers will direct buyers away from listings with lower commissions, a well-documented phenomenon known as steering. Now, I want to make it pretty clear real quickly. I don't agree with this. I don't think the DOJ is correct on this. I don't think this is steering. I don't think anybody who operates in this industry and understands the machinations of how everything works thinks it's steering. But the fact is, that is what the DOJ thinks in this case. The other thing is during the verbal arguments of that case, they actually made this statement. We believe offers of compensation should not be made anywhere, but certainly not on the MLS. So what the DOJ has made clear in this case is that they don't believe offers of compensation should be made anywhere because they believe it leads to steering. Now, whether they're right on that or not is an entire debate. However, it is kind of where things are going. Now, the other thing I want to talk about as part of this statement of interest is this section where the DOJ spent about 3 pages talking about the industry's history of resisting commission competition. And what that talked about is that around 1950 there was another antitrust case that NAR lost, and that one was regarding commission tables that were set back then, where it was actually against the code of ethics to act against them. But what the DOJ does here is they spend about 3 pages bellyaching about how it took 20 years of them going after the industry and having to repeatedly take the industry to court in order to get all of us to act right. So what this tells me throughout this settlement is that A, the DOJ is not big fans of ours because of our industry of resisting commission competition, and B, they believe offers of compensation should not be made anywhere in the MLS, or should be made anywhere at all, but it's certainly not the MLS. Now, I'm going to touch on that a little bit later, but right now I just kind of want to I want you to put that in the back of your head. I want you to kind of mull on that a little bit while I get to my bigger point in a little bit. But real quickly, I do want to stop and address a rumor, one of the big questions that's out there. The DOJ does not have the authority to prevent this settlement. Full stop. They can submit a statement of interest. They may submit a statement of interest. We don't know if they will or not, but they do not have the authority to prevent the settlement. At this point in time, the judge, the plaintiffs, and the defendants have all given preliminary approval. Everybody thinks the settlement is in the best interest moving forward, and I do not see any reason for the settlement to be overturned. Is there still a chance? Yeah, of course there is, but it's a very, very small chance and not something that I would hang my hat on. Again, that's Richard's opinion, but that's just not something that's going to happen here. So I want to kind of go into some of the bigger questions that have been asked now, and some of those tough questions that people ask. And one of the first ones is, why settle? If we have a denial of wrongdoing and we don't think we did anything wrong, why not appeal? So let's talk a little bit about this second question first off. Why didn't NAR talk about the pro-competitive benefits of buyer broker compensation? Well, first off, they did. During the trial, we did have expert witnesses on stand that talked about the pro-competitive benefits of buyer broker compensation. It talked about first-time home buyers. When I bought my first house, I had $400 in my bank account. I was that buyer. So they talked about that. They talked about what about disproportionate impact to veterans? What about disproportionate impact to protected classes? What about interested party contributions? All these different questions that came out when the settlement first happened, NAR did say in the stand, but they were not allowed to be considered by the jury. And this is where we're going to start to get into a little bit of legal stuff. Again, I am not a lawyer. This is purely Richard's opinion from stuff I've read and things I've followed up on. Completely willing to be wrong on this if any lawyer wants to talk about it. But there's two different ways an antitrust case can be heard. There is either rule of reason or another type called per se. The per se analysis says that the evidence of collusion is so great that you are not allowed to consider any kind of pro-competitive benefits of said collusion. And this is where NAR believes that the judge made a mistake, because it's the judge who determines which type the case is filed under. Now, NAR believes that the judge made that mistake because there was no actual evidence of collusion. There was no smoky room. There was no people getting together and talking about colluding to set a certain level of commissions and things like that. It just wasn't there. So we believe that the per se analysis should not have been used. Now, whether that's true or not would have been determined by an appeal. So why didn't we appeal? Well, the short answer to that is $5.8 billion. In order to appeal, you still have to pay the plaintiff. Under just kind of court theory, a plaintiff should not continue to be harmed because you're going through an appeal process. And the bond, in order to post said appeal, would have been $5.8 billion. And if you gather all the coffers of the National Association of Realtors, every state association, every local association, every a local regional MLS, we don't have $5.8 billion. So it was at this point NAR had a decision to make. NAR could have said, hey, we're going to file bankruptcy. It's going to take us out of the settlement. It's going to resolve this for us. But then everybody else is going to be left to fight on their own. And at the point of the settlement, there was 37 copycat cases that had come out between October and March. And they were increasing at that point at a rate of about 2 or 3 a week. So NAR said, okay, if we enter into this settlement, we hunker down, we can help solve these other copycat cases, and we can continue this fight. So that was why the settlement happened. Because to avoid bankruptcy of the industry, to help everybody settle this and we can all move on, we don't have to all fight these individual cases. And then, just like I said, we just quite frankly couldn't afford the appeal. So, and a note about those copycat cases, once those started coming out, they included brokerages, they included MLSs, they included associations, they included some teams, they even included a couple individual brokers in some cases, and some individual agents as well. So, by entering into the settlement, everybody who was under those copycat cases or would have been in the additional copycat cases that would have kept going can instead move forward, focus on our businesses, and continue serving consumers in an incredible way like we all do. So that's the reason why we entered into the settlement and chose not to appeal. So the other one that we hear a lot is it's not final. We need to wait and see. So the reason why you're seeing all these changes come out effective October 17th or sooner in some cases is because under the settlement approval process, NAR is required to implement the practice changes no later than August 17th. Anybody who is still operating against a settlement or under the old way of doing things after August 17th is opening themselves up to potential liability. So in order to comply with the settlement, everything is going into effect on October 17th. Now, the people that say it's not final, they're actually not wrong. Over here on the right, you see this like November 26th. That's when you actually have the hearing for final approval. But really, that is just a court technicality at this point. As I mentioned before, the plaintiffs, the defendant, and the judge have all given preliminary approval back in April. There is no reason to think that this settlement might be significantly changed by the end. There may be some places that there's minor tweaks to the language to clarify things, but that would really be it. So any kind of talk again about this, the settlement's not approval, we need to wait and see. It's really just head in the sand. It's really time to move on. So the settlement is happening. The provisions of the settlement are already in place. They're already mandatory by NAR MLS policy as of August 17th. It's time to move forward. Other things we get: advertising commission on the MLS. Can you advertise it on the MLS as long as you call it something different? No. Can you put it in showing time? No. Can you hide it in other places? No. I mean, really, we really all need to think about the spirit of the settlement, and the spirit of the settlement is that compensation is removed from the MLS. Now, there are a lot of other things you can do off of the MLS that are okay, but the answer as far as anything attached to the MLS or the association, no. We just cannot do it. There will be a $500 fine from the MLS for people that do it. And like I said, we'll talk a little bit later about what fields being removed and things like that. But just bottom line is, it's time to move on. Figure out ways. If you're going to advertise compensation at all, which I'm going to get into that conversation in a bit, you have to do it off of the MLS. Now, another common question we get is, what about a concession field? California Regional MLS, when all this started first coming down, brought up the idea of having a concession field. And they at first were going to do it. But at this point, they've actually opted against it now. They've now taken it out, where they are not going to be having that concession advertised in there. And part of the reason for that is that the California Association of Realtors came out with their new forms about the settlement. Or post-settlement that kind of talked about the different ways of doing compensation. The DOJ raised their hand and said, hey, we'd like to take a look at those. And they had meetings with the California Association of Realtors, and California Association of Realtors has now taken compensation out of the listing agreements entirely. So now there is no concession for the seller to provide. So California Regional opted to also remove those fields. The other point I would like to make about concession fields is that these fields were not important enough for us to have before the settlement. So adding them after the settlement doesn't quite feel right. Like if you just think about that from a kind of back up and get a 50,000 foot view, you didn't need it and now you have to have it. There's something not quite right there. So no, we will not be adding concession fields to the MLS. Historical data is an ongoing discussion. When we actually remove the fields, the data is kind of kept in a database that nobody can access, not staff, not board members, nobody can access. It is still going to exist in case we decide to do something with it in the future. As of right now, though, the best way forward is to just remove the data completely and then just kind of see what happens in the market and if that data is going to be needed in the future. A couple things I like pointing out about the buyer agreements. So it does have to be signed as of right now before touring a home. But you don't have to have one signed for open houses or for sign calls, because in those cases you're representing the seller. Now, if during that process there comes a point where you're going to begin representing the buyer, that's where you really need to have a discussion with your broker and maybe even your attorney about at what point you should start signing that. At what point do you begin representing the buyer? But I can be very clear, it is not necessary for open houses or sign calls. One key point I want to point out is that while there is a requirement within the settlement and within the MLS rules that you do have a buyer agreement signed prior to touring a home, it does not necessarily have to be the buyer representation agreement provided by Bluegrass Realtors. You can have your own. There are 4 provisions in the MLS rules that must be in it if you do have your own. So you can always reach out to us if you have questions about that. Of course, we do recommend using the buyer representation agreement because that is the best way forward for everybody, because it is the most transparent way to talk about the services you're going to be offering, how much you're going to be paid, and things like that. However, I do have to make it clear that there's no requirement that it has to be the Bluegrass Realtors buyer representation agreement. So if you have other questions about that, reach out at the help@bluegrassrealtors.com there at the bottom. When the settlement first came out, there's a lot of questions about loans. How are commissions going to be paid on VA loans? Can our commissions be bundled in loans? What about impact interested party contributions? A lot of these different questions have been answered since then, thanks to NAR. One of the jokes I make when I make this in a room is I ask people to raise their hands if they've ever been able to get government to do anything within 4 months. One of the previous association I worked with over in Albuquerque, it literally took more than 4 months to get a building permit, much less having the Veterans Administration and Fannie and Freddie come out and put out these letters they have saying that the Veterans Administration is going to allow commissions to be paid on VA loans, and Fannie and Freddie coming out with their letters saying that realtor commissions are not going to count against interested party contributions. So those are major wins for NAR right there. One of the questions I'm going to address later is why should I continue to be a member of NAR? Right there. Their proof is in the pudding. They were able, through their relationships that they built through their advocacy, to have the Veterans Administration and have Fannie and Freddie come out and make these statements for us that are going to make it a lot clearer moving forward. So those are big questions that have been answered by NAR. Now, one looming question that I see keep coming up is what about rolling it into the loan? If a buyer needs to pay it because the seller is not willing to for whatever reason, can the buyer roll that into the loan? And as of right now, NAR has not actually taken a stance on that. They are doing a lot of research into it because there could be some long-term effects that we need to think about. If a buyer rolls it into the loan and now they're paying the interest on that for 30 years, is that really the best thing for the buyer? There's a lot of questions that we need to really think about and think through because, number one is that NAR and your local association and realtors in general are pro-consumer, and we want to make sure we're doing the right thing for the consumer. So there's a lot of questions there. But bottom line is, if that were to happen, it's probably going to need legislation from Congress in order to happen. So if it happens at all, it's going to be a long ways off. So that's kind of the bottom line on that. But it's not something I would expect to see very soon at all. So the next question we get a lot is, what about paying the settlement? NAR paid a large price to pay. Are realtors going to have to pay additional fees in the future to cover that cost? So like I mentioned already, NAR has already said they will not be raising dues in 24 or 25 in response to this settlement. The settlement is spread out over 4 years. It's something like $150 for the first year, and then $75 and $75, and then remaining balance in the fourth year. So first off, it is spread out over some time. Second off, NAR has already been hard at work trimming the fat in their budget. One of the places that I want to give them some credit for is President Kevin Sears, who is going to be the president for NAR for both 24 and 25, has already put an end to what was called the presidential initiatives. The presidential initiatives is places that NAR did budget money for in order to pay for different things. Like there was, this year was supposed to be an Ignite Others that former President Tracy Casper was going to be pushing behind, where realtors were going to be going into high schools and talking about the benefit of being a realtor. Before that was Riding with the Brand with Kenny Parcells. In the past, there's been other things where presidents have these different initiatives that some marketing money is put behind in order to push forward these initiatives. Those budgets have just been straight cut, just right off the top. Those budgets have been cut as one example of places that NAR is saving money. So NAR is hard at work at trimming the fat in the budget. They really want to make sure that they are able to pay the settlement entirely and do not have to pass on those costs to realtors. That being said, as I'll talk about a little bit later, I do think NAR provides incredible value for the $160 or so a year that you pay them. But we'll talk about that some in a little bit. So one of the things, I don't think I've mentioned it in this video yet, but people have heard me say it elsewhere, is that I truly think this settlement could be the best thing that ever happened to our industry. And people are like, wait, really? And guys, I get it. It doesn't feel that way right now. I know that. It doesn't. There's a lot of work involved. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of going to be some building airplanes while flying them while we go here. But I really do think in the end it's going to end up being the best thing for us. So just a couple kind of key points to bring up here. There was a realtor that I spoke with in Albuquerque who had been doing this for over 50 years. Gentleman he's been doing this for a long time, just incredibly intelligent. He taught classes over there. And one of the things he told me was, he said, Richard, at this point, I've been through about 10 ends of the world. The real estate industry has seen a lot of changes in the last 50 years. And you know what? the world keeps moving on. And I think the reason for that is that people need people. This industry has seen, when Century 21 first started doing national franchising, that was the end of the world. When Remax came out with their business model, that was the end of the world. When listings started getting put on the internet, on Zillow and things like that, that was the end of the world. But again and again and again, the real estate industry has continued to thrive, not just survive, but even thrive, because people need people. The bottom line is, when people are looking to buy or sell a home, it is an incredibly complicated transaction, and realtors provide incredible value through that transaction to help people move through it. We live in a world right now where things like DoorDash exist because people don't even want to cook their own food. Those same people are not going to wake up one day and be like, hey, I'm going to go sell my own house. It's not going to happen, guys. People need people, and they want a realtor. They want a trusted professional who deals with this stuff every single day to help move them through the most complicated and inexpensive transactions of their lives. And that's not going to change. So, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, how a realtor gets paid in this transaction might change. But if a realtor gets paid, absolutely not changing. Because consumers need that person to walk them through that process. Now, one of the places, a kind of a bigger picture that I think some people might not be thinking about, I like pointing out, is let's talk a little bit about innovation and how and what this can change in the industry for us. So previous to real estate, I was actually in the call center world. And in the call center world, if you wanted a statistic like your average handle time to improve, you put a bonus on it. And what you would see is that is if you put a bonus on handle time, then people would work harder to get their handle time lower so they can earn that bonus. Now, other stats might suffer. Your transfer rate might go up or issue resolution might go down, but every average handle time would get better. And the next month, you move the bonus somewhere else. And the reason for that just comes down to basic human nature of show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome. It's really that simple. And I think if we look across the industry and we look at where the incentive has been up to this point, at least the entire conversation about incentive has all been on the listing side. And that is why I think that if you look at all the trainings, you look at all the products, you look at the books that have been written, you look at the real estate coaches that are out there and what their focus is, I don't think it's a stretch to say that it has been 80% focused on the listing side of the transaction. And because of this settlement, I promise you, there are hundreds of new rooms of nerds across the country right now trying to figure out what we can do better to serve the buyer side. And it's going to create a lot of innovation on that side of the business. We've had listing presentations. What about buyer presentations? We've had listing side net sheets. What about buyer net sheets? We've had, we may even need to start considering things like proof of funds from a buyer, like for the realtor, not just for the seller. So there's a lot of different things that we haven't really considered on the buyer side that are going to start coming out that are going to drive a lot of innovation in the marketplace. And, I talked a lot earlier about DOJ and then, talking about not offering compensation and things like that. And I think they get vilified a little bit as, oh, they want compensation to be lower, but I don't really think that's it. I think what the DOJ really wants to see is just is competition, innovation, different business models, and everybody competing against each other in the space. And realtors already do compete. We all know that. It may not be easy to see, because one of the other points I make is showcase the complexities, sell the simplicity, right? Realtors have made it look really easy because you're good at what you do. And they've made the process look easy, and the rest of the outside world doesn't really see that. And they don't see the competition that happens, and they don't see the work that happens. So part of what we need to do as an industry is really get better about showcasing that complexity and showcasing the competition and showcasing the work that goes into this. And I think between the competition and innovation that's going to happen and us showcasing how hard it really is to get to a closed deal table or to a closed deal at the end to make everybody move into this house, I think it's going to be really good for everybody because people are going to see that, and they're going to see that complexity, and they're going to see what a realtor goes through. So that is kind of the best thing that ever happened to us forward looking on this. Now, the next thing I want to step into is going to be a little more future looking. So, I kind of alluded to it a couple times that I'm not sure we need to know what compensation is, and I think that's where the DOJ would really like to see this go. So I want to talk up for a second about that, but real quickly, I do need to park here for a second and say that, look, this is future looking. Like, this is possible on our forms right now, but it's not exactly how the forms are written. I also need to point out that, this is just one business practice. Some brokerages and agents may choose to do this right now, but some may not. And there's nothing wrong with that. Just because I'm saying this does not make this the law of the land, right? It is a business practice that I do think is where the industry is going, and I think 2, maybe 5 years from now, I don't know the timing, that this is kind of where we're going to end up. But that doesn't mean it's what you have to do right now. So I want to be very, very, very super clear on that. So where I think this is going to go is talking about on a transaction. Let me do it this way. We're going to know two things. So the listing side is going to know what the seller is willing to give from their net in order to close a transaction. The buying side is going to know what the buyer wants and needs in order to close the transaction. And that's it. There's no communication otherwise in between until you get your purchase agreement, and then in the middle, you have your negotiation. So just parking on this slide for a little bit, I kind of let's start by talking about what the buyer wants and needs to close a transaction. So one of the things I do when I'm in a room of people is I ask people to raise their hand. How many people have gone to a listing and you did not know you needed a carpet allowance until you walked into the house and you smelled cat? And across the room, there's always some hands that go up, right? Because you can't smell the MLS, at least not yet. I mean, things might change in the future. We'll see. But you can't smell the MLS. So you did not know until you crossed the threshold of that house and you smelled cat that you needed a carpet allowance on that house. What you did know is that your buyer does not want to live in a house that smells like cat. You knew that, right? The analogy there is that you don't know what the compensation is sometimes until you walk in the door. And I'm going to get to what that looks on the seller side, but just like you don't know if a house needs a roof until you get the inspection. You don't know that there was a foundation issue until you placed a marble on the floor and watched it roll into a corner. You didn't know that you needed a carpet allowance until you walked in the house and smelled cat. So the buyer compensation just becomes another part of the negotiation process that what your buyer you and your buyer have agreed to on your buyer agreement. You also know what your buyer is capable of paying. And that may be zero. It's not always zero, but it may be. Especially for first-time home buyers. So these are things that you know, and these are what you are on the negotiations are on your side of the transaction. Now let's go to the other side. What is the seller willing to give from their net to close the transaction? Now, the first point I make is that what matters to the seller in a transaction is that, first off, that the house gets sold. Right? They want the house to sell because they have whatever, maybe they're moving to their next house, maybe they're moving out of the area. They need the house to sell. Some sellers need it to sell faster than others. So that's part of the process, right? And if they want to sell faster, they know they may not get top dollar than if they're able to wait a little bit. That's part of this. The other part now is, what is the seller willing to give up from their net? Now, the example I use here is like, okay, if a seller is willing to give up, we'll say $20,000 from their net in order to make a deal close, but a buyer comes along and that buyer only needs $10,000, why should the seller show their hand? That's kind of a question that I want people to kind of think about as we move through this, is by advertising the compensation, you are kind of showing your seller's hand. There's some sellers that are going to be okay with that. Some sellers, especially if you get into a market where there's 25 houses for every buyer, you might need to advertise that compensation. Nobody can tell Burger King that they can't do a buy one, get one free offer on a burger, right? If it needs to be used as a selling tactic, then use it as a selling tactic, and that's okay. But balance that with, is the seller leaving money on the table? So the key part I'm trying to get across here is not that one side is bad, one side is good. The fact is that this is another lever to pull, and how hard you pull that lever is going to be determined by the seller. If the seller has to absolutely move that house fast, and they don't care about leaving a little bit more money on the table, then maybe you pull that compensation advertising lever. Maybe you pull the showing their cards. But maybe if they do care about top dollar and they want to have a higher net, maybe you think about doing this a little differently. And one of those business practices that I want to make sure everybody's aware that you're going to hear is if you call up and you ask, hey, what's the listing compensation you're offering on this? You might hear, our seller is willing to entertain any and all offers of compensation, put it in the purchase agreement. So the key there is that doesn't mean no. That does not mean they're not offering compensation. It means that they're willing to entertain it, and it's going to depend on what their net is. Whether the compensation, like, I'll just use crazy numbers, but whether the compensation is 10% or 50% doesn't really matter to the seller. What matters is their net. Of course, it also matters that the house is able to appraise. So 50% probably isn't going to happen. But what matters to the seller is their net. So that's the business practice I think you're going to start seeing more of, and people need to kind of be okay with, and honestly where I think it's going to end up in the future. The closer we can get the compensation to the offer, I think the better for everybody. This idea of having the compensation right up front before even touring a home, according to the DOJ, leads to steering. Again, according to the DOJ, that leads to steering. So the later in the process we can move the compensation conversation, it's, I think, what's going to be better for everybody in the long run. Now, again, caveat, doesn't mean you have to do that. We're future looking here, just kind of talking about business practices and helping people just kind of wrap their head around this idea of the world where we're probably going to end up is the seller knows what they need, the buyer knows what they need, and everybody meets in the middle and negotiates. So just start thinking about this as another lever to pull. It's another scale that you have to work through as part of this new world that we're moving into. So, of course, any questions on that, guys, I gave you my email back at the beginning, richard@bluegrassrealtors.com. I'm always willing to have conversations about this. I know just based on that conversation I just had, you probably have a whole lot of yeah buts. That's okay. Let's call and talk about them. Let's get me in front of some more brokerages and talk this through. I don't mind having those hard conversations, guys. So the next thing I want to do is I kind of want to go into some nitty gritty about some logistics of what things are actually going to look like on the MLS, right? So of course we're going to be eliminating those compensation fields. The MLS cannot create, facilitate, or support any website that lists compensation. So we can't have any kind of direct feed to a platform like that. Cooperative compensation is still allowed off the MLS. I talked a little bit just then about can versus should already, and then we have those written agreements. Now, before I get off this page, I want to park on these two just a little bit, the require the non-MLS mechanism. So the spirit of the settlement here is that the MLS cannot do anything to facilitate somebody recreating the old way, is essentially all it's doing. So if somebody tries to recreate a website that has compensation from multiple brokerages on it, and that website is getting a data feed from the MLS is required to terminate that data feed. So that we cannot do. However, if somebody goes off and they're creating their own website that does that without the MLS's data feed, we have no control over that. I can't stop somebody from doing that. However, I do strongly believe you should talk to an attorney about whether that's a good idea or not, because there is now a verdict and a settlement in place that says aggregating and sharing compensation is a bad idea. So if somebody decides to do that, that's their own legal risk, and I strongly advise against it. But I have no control to stop it. So that's just kind of the point I want to make there. But let's get into some nitty-gritty. On August 16th, these 4 fields are being removed from the MLS, and all the data is being removed along with them. So there's no action required on a Bluegrass Realtors or Imagine MLS subscribers' part to do anything with their listing. Now, and then even if you have a listing agreement, as long as your listing agreement does not mention a requirement to put the compensation on the MLS, you don't actually have to amend that either. because, again, offers of compensation off of the MLS are still allowed. Now, I did take a quick look at our listing agreement, both before and after settlement, and I did not see any mention of the MLS. That being said, I have not looked at every iteration of it. So just look at your listing agreement. If it doesn't mention the MLS, you don't have to do anything. There's actually nothing you need to do to amend that agreement, because talking about advertising and offering commission is okay as long as it's not on the MLS. So the only way you have to do anything to amend your agreements is if it says that it must be advertised on the MLS. So honestly, there's nothing you really need to do there except just know that it's not going to be on the MLS anymore. Now, there are fines in place for this. If we detect any kind of commission information being shared on the MLS, there is an immediate fine of $500. Similarly, if you fail to get the buyer representation agreement before the first showing on a tour, there is a warning with a subsequent fine of $250 for that. Again, important note, you are not required to use a Bluegrass Realtors version of the buyer representation agreement. You just have to have one, and it has to have those four things that we talked about and that are in there. And the four things, just as a reminder, you have to set a commission level. That commission has to be objectively ascertainable. So it has to be like a number. It can't say something like, oh, we're going to be this number plus whatever's offered. That's not allowed. You have to have a disclosure that states that you are not going to accept additional compensation above and beyond that number. And then you have to have a disclosure that says that commissions are not set by law and are negotiable. So that's the four things that have to be in there. As long as you have those four things, you meet the qualifications as far as the MLS rules go. Of course, we have a lot of new and revised forms. The most version of those forms have been sent out and are available in your member portal. And then we also, of course, have a lot of the classes and things that are available in the member portal as well. And let me get that pulled up here. If you go here on bluegrassrealtors.com/settlement, or you can also go to your member dashboard and click on the NAR settlement number right there. There's a video on there by Nathan Billings. It's about an hour and a half long that goes through all these different forms and how the deal flow is going to work and things like that. So make sure you're educating yourself there. And we also have a lot of upcoming classes as well. So I'm recording this video on August 13th. So as of now, this is all the stuff that's coming. By the time you watch this video, it might be after September 24th. But if you are, just go to that Bluegrass Realtor /event/courses or back on your member dashboard, click on the register for classes and events. And we are going to continue having a lot of classes coming out about this. So lots of resources out there available for you on this. So to help you work through those forms and all these other things that are going on with those updated forms and the update to the MLS rules. Now, the last thing I want to do here is I kind of want to park for a little bit on NAR benefits. One of the questions we get a lot is, why should I still be an NAR member? So the first and I think most obvious question about this about the NAR membership is lawsuit mitigation. Anybody who is a member of NAR by August 17th is released of liability and no longer legally responsible for any claims of damages related to this issue or case. So that's a big benefit, right? But we've already spent a lot of time beating up on the settlement and things like that. The other thing I want to talk about some is advocacy. So a big part of NAR's value proposition is their advocacy, and that they will continue to deliver unparalleled value on behalf of realtors, including resources, research, member tools, and advocacy on Capitol Hill. Now, the key priorities of advocacy are, of course, access to home ownership, equal access to professional representation, and supporting fair housing. So we already talked about how NAR has worked with the VA and Fannie and Freddie and helped a lot with making sure everybody has equal access to professional representation and allowing VI brokers to compensate their brokers. That was a big win for NAR. Things with access to home ownership. One of the ones that I love to talk about with home ownership is flood insurance, right? So Every year Congress gets into this little tit for tat where they talk about the funding and they're funding the government and there's going to be a government shutdown. And increasingly, they start trying to pull flood insurance into that conversation. And NAR every single year has to sit down and remind our lawmakers that, hey, if you let this lapse, even for a single day, not only are you going to affect, tens of thousands of transactions across the country that are happening that week, but there's no guarantee we're even going to get it back. So that's a fight that NAR has to consistently do on a consistent basis to make sure flood insurance remains as part of it. Another one that happens under advocacy that I love to bring up is independent contractor status. There has been a push, and especially in certain states and even some at the federal level, to remove the clause that allows realtors to be a 1099 independent contractor. If there's any brokerages out there that have looked into what it would cost for all of your realtors to become W-2 employees, I think you would see that cost will be very prohibitive, very high, because you would be required to offer health insurance for every single person. And then individual agents, you would not realize the tax benefits of being a 1099 contractor. I think that alone is worth $160 a year. If you're not getting $160 a year of tax relief from being a 1099 independent contractor, I recommend talking with a tax professional, because there's probably a very easy way to get more than $160 of the tax benefit each year. And of course, NAR continues to support fair housing at every level to make sure that we have equal access for all the protected classes. These are all things that NAR works for on advocacy on just a daily basis for you. One of my favorite things to do is I tell people, if you go to nar.realtor/advocacy, one more time, that's nar.realtor/advocacy. Click on all federal issues and just look through all the issues that are on there. There's, I believe, somewhere around 100 federal issues that NAR focuses on every year. I want you to pick 3 of them at random and just go in and read about it. It'll take you about 2 minutes to read about it. And I want you to consider what your business looks like without them fighting for those issues at the federal level for you every single year. I'm a strong believer in advocacy for NAR. I believe that what they do keeps our industry alive and well, and protects consumers at every level to make sure that consumers do have equal access to professional representation, they have access to home ownership, and do it in a way that is fair for everybody. So, of course, I do have to take a second here and give a plug for RPAC. RPAC dollars are what make these kind of things happen, and they fund the candidates that help make sure that these initiatives continue to work in the way they should. One of the things I always love pointing out is, like, guys, I get it. I'm not a huge fan of politics either. The whole red versus blue, extreme right, extreme left, I think it's all a mess. I'm right there in the middle with most of you, right? The Realtor Party is as well. If you look at what the candidates that the RPAC, the Realtor Party funds each year, it's usually pretty stinking close to 50-50, red versus blue, right? Of course, some years it might go 49-51, but then the next year it'll go right the other direction. The Realtor Party interviews these candidates and supports the ones that support our industry. So it is not a red versus blue thing. It is a what is right for home ownership, equal access to professional representation, and what's right for fair housing. So the 3 things that you can do with RPAC is vote, act, and invest. Of course, always vote, register, show up to vote, and encourage others to vote. We're not going to tell you how to vote. You vote with what is right for you. We may have recommendations, but that's not necessarily saying you have to go that direction. But we do want you to vote. Show up, be involved, and vote. The second one is act. We have these calls to action that go out. Well, I think there's only been one in the last 3 years. There was one for the flood insurance. There was one for during COVID about independent contractors being able to operate as a necessary service. So they don't go out often, but when you do see them, participate in them. And guys, I'm telling you, it makes an impact. I have talked to so many people that work in advocacy circles and work with congressmen and congresswomen that say, like, we hear you guys. It's okay. You can stop bugging us so much. Those call to actions do work. And then when we have those days at the Capitol, participate. Show up. Show Congress and local legislatures and state legislatures the power of the Realtor Party. We show up and we have a voice, and we have that voice on Capitol Hill. And then, of course, the final one is invest. You guys, when you're paying your dues, there's that that line item on there for RPAC. Just don't uncheck that. It's $25. I promise you're getting more than $25 of value out of advocacy. I always say that if people truly understood the value of advocacy, we would have 4,000 major investors at this association, and the major investor level is $1,000 a year. Again, going back to those advocacy points that I talked about, if we truly understood the impact and the value of what those things do, everybody would pop down $1,000, no question. So $25 is not a big ask. So the first thing we ask is just don't uncheck that. Support the people who support us, support these advocacy efforts. Of course, if you have any kind of questions about advocacy, you can reach out to Crystal Long right here. She's our government affairs director. Her email is crystal@Bluegrass Realtors. She's happy to answer any kind of questions you have and answer any kind of concerns and things like that. So quite a bit of information available on there as far as RPAC goes. So going back to NAR's value proposition, just another couple things to touch on here about other things that NAR provides. NAR research. If you nar.realtor/research, there are about 100 different reports that they put out every single year there. One of my favorites to point out is the Home Buyers and Sellers Report. Every year, what NAR does is they go out and they survey a bunch of home buyers and sellers who have recently bought or sold a home, and they ask them questions like, what part of the home buying process was most important to you? And that's the kind of question that I think a practicing realtor should really want to know the answer to, because it helps you determine where to focus your business. One of the jokes about marketing is there was a CEO who said, I don't remember who right now, but he said, half of my marketing dollars aren't working. The problem is I don't know which half. So getting out and reading those reports and getting access to that is valuable information that I think you may want to know. Of course, NAR has a lot of different educational resources and accreditations and designations. One designation that's being offered for free until the end of 2024 is the Accredited Buyer Representative designation, ABR. That's a good way to learn about representing buyers, which is good to know post-settlement. There's another designation called the Real Estate Negotiation Expert designation. That one's not free until the end of the year, but it's another really good one to help sharpen your saw on your negotiation process. Real quick side note, this isn't NAR, but a book that I love about negotiation that helps you kind of sharpen that saw on how to negotiate is called Never Split the Difference. It's a book by Chris Voss. He's a former FBI hostage negotiator. Great book, audiobooks available as well, videos, classes, all kinds of stuff available on that. So just another little side note, little nugget for you to help increase your ability with negotiation. NAR also has all their benefit partners and discounts. There's discounts from Lenovo, Dell, Budget, Hertz Rental Car, things like that. So go check those out. And then, of course, they have their marketing campaign, although That's Who We Are campaign, to let consumers know that, look, realtors aren't just out there to get a bunch of money and help you with a house. They're there to help you through the most complicated transaction of your life. They're involved in the community. We have the Good Neighbor Awards going out there. We have all the different things that NAR pushes out to help focus on the value of a realtor, well beyond just being a salesperson. You're so much more than that. And NAR does a pretty good job of getting that information out there for you. So the last thing to touch on here is just like I said, we are here for you. We're here to help. So 859-276-3503, help at bluegrassrealtors.com. If you guys have any questions about this presentation, any questions about the settlement, we're here to help. Others on staff can answer these questions as well. I'm, of course, willing to answer them. We're in this together, guys. Like I talked about a little while ago, I do think this settlement is going to be good for the industry. Here's what I know. I know that people need people, and a seller wants to sell a house. A buyer wants to buy a house. In between, you have realtors, you have lenders, you have title companies. All of the people in this transaction have a vested interest in getting that transaction to the closing table, and you're all going to figure it out. That is what I know. Realtors are some of the most adaptable people on the planet. How many of you have, you're cruising along, this deal's going great, and bam, something blows up out of nowhere, and you don't know how this deal is going to close, but you know what? You got together, you put your heads together, and you figured it out. And just a lot of that is what's going to be happening, and that's okay. There's going to be some building airplanes while flying it, guys. We know. We understand. We're here to help. So we're going to get through this together. I think 2 or 3 years from now, we're all going to look back and wonder what we were all so worried about, because realtors are going to continue providing incredible value for the consumer through the most complex and likely most expensive transaction of their lives. So we're here for you. Reach out if you need help. Thanks for watching, and everybody, just have a wonderful day and get out there and sell some homes. Thanks, and talk again soon.